Good evening, everyone. I'm Colleen Jacks. I'm co-president of the St. Peter League, and this is the first, maybe not the last time that the Edina League and the St. Peter Area League of Women Voters is doing a joint presentation for a membership meeting. It's a pleasure for me to introduce my friend and former colleague, Professor Dr. Max Hailperin tonight. Max joined the Gustavus Adolphus College Math, Computer Science, and Statistics group in 1990, coming to Minnesota from graduate studies at Stanford University. And then he retired and became a professor emeritus in 2016. He was highly regarded for his teaching and service to the Gustavus campus community. He's the author of 2 computer science textbooks and won the Edgar M. Carlson Award for Distinguished Teaching in 2009. In 2014, the Faculty Service Award was given to him for his work as the leader of the Faculty Senate that helped create a climate of cooperation between the college faculty and board of trustees, among other constituencies. While on the faculty at Gustavus, he became involved in issues related to election technology. He provided testimony to the Minnesota legislature on electronic rosters and poll books in 2011 and 2014, and an online registration in 2014. And then he was appointed by Governor Dayton to the electronic roster task force in 2013 and 2014. And because of all this work, he was awarded the National Association of Secretaries of State Medallion Award, recognizing his established record of promoting their goals relative to areas of elections and civic education and service to state government. And he continues to write and speak on these issues, and that's in part how we came to have him this evening, because of the series he's been doing for the Minnesota Reformer. So when he isn't busy with his election-related work, he walks the streets of Minneapolis. He has a personal project to walk on foot every street, every block, and every neighborhood of Minneapolis. So some of you might see him out and about. And he posts on his adventures when he's out walking at his website called allofminneapolis.com. So I just want to mention that he will answer questions at the end of his presentation, and you should put any comments or questions into the chat box. And Julie Bascom-Rogers of the Edina League, who's handling the technology with Zoom tonight, will monitor the chat box and direct those questions to Max. So welcome, Max. We're so pleased to have you speak with us tonight, or for us tonight.
Thank you, Colleen. And I'm very pleased also to be able to speak with a League audience. I think the League has long established a not only a sympathy with the ideal of democracy, but a practice of how to better approximate that ideal. And I would say it's very similar to my own approach, which is kind of an integration of educating ourselves, educating others, and active participation in the mechanics of the democratic processes. And so that makes me pleased to be in this sort of a group, if I can say I'm in it when I'm sitting here on my own sofa, but also a little daunted because I know many of you are already quite familiar with how election administration in Minnesota works. But given the really intense attention that the topic has gotten, and sometimes rather hostile attention, I think it's important we all have a common vocabulary, a common baseline view of how our elections work. So I'm sort of taking a grand tour kind of approach. Everything from registration through voting, through the post-election processes, and trying to, if not cover everything election administrators do, at least many of the highlights. Speaking of election administrators, I have to say, it's been a great privilege for me to work either for or with a number of election administrators, municipal, county, and state, and I've learned a great deal from them. So I want to honor them and acknowledge that it's they who I owe this understanding to, but also say I can't speak on behalf of any of them, whether they've employed me or not. I'm not an authorized spokesperson. I wouldn't in any case be able to realistically speak for them. They know more than I do. I'm still learning. If you hear anything different from your local administrator than what I say, certainly I would defer to them. I know many of you have also served as election judges. It's an incredibly valuable thing. That's certainly part of what I've done. I think I've served in all the different venues election judges are active in polling places, in healthcare facilities, absentee ballot board, post-election review, recounts. I don't think I'm missing any there. And I know many of you may have served in one or more of those as well. Certainly something we can encourage other people to do as a way of gaining firsthand experience. And I would say, back to Colleen's introduction, that those things matter more than my PhD or whatever. That we've seen quite a few of the instant experts who have popped up in the last couple of years, who have no practical experience at all, tout their educational credentials as some sort of substitute, and it just doesn't work that way. So I would downplay maybe my own education and say it's the practice that matters. As far as an overview, I think one way to think about it is in terms of the division of responsibilities between the different layers of government. And that's something that's specific to our state, just like every aspect of election law varies from state to state. If you go to other states, you may find that the municipal government is doing something that here is done by the county, or that the state government is doing something that's here done by the county, or so forth. But in Minnesota, at least in recent decades, the county has had a great deal of responsibility. They've had the responsibility for all voter registration. So if you submit a voter registration online at the Secretary of State's portal, or on paper by leaving it with your city clerk, or doing it at a city polling place, it's always going to be forwarded to the county. The county is in charge of all maintenance of the voter lists. They're also in charge of the basic organizational structure of all elections, except the ones that are exclusively municipal elections or school district elections. But anything where there's a state or federal component or county component, such as the election we're in the midst of currently, they would be the ones who would set up the ballot. They would be the ones who would configure the election equipment to correspond to those ballots. They're the ones who are going to pull all the results together at the end. But the actual election day polling place is pretty much a municipal responsibility. That you have cities who are finding the election judges, who are finding the locations, who are getting all the equipment to be in the right place at the right time, taking care of all of that stuff. The exception is that a local county can agree to take on those responsibilities that otherwise would be municipal. And the big example of that is Ramsey County. City of St. Paul, which is the second largest city in the state, has no election department at all. The Ramsey County elections handles everything for that whole county. The other way around for absentee voting that's usually a county responsibility, but the cities can take it on, and some do. Minneapolis is the example of a city that has fully taken responsibility for absentee voting. Other cities commonly do the in-person absentee voting, where you can go, for example, I believe Edina City Hall would be an example of this, where you can go and vote in person during the 46-day period. The question I often get is, if the cities and the counties are doing everything, why do we make such a big deal out of the Secretary of State's office? Doesn't sound like they have anything to do. And that's not true. They're the ones who are providing the statewide consistency. They're the ones who are coordinating everything. They provide the training materials that the counties use, hold in-person training sessions, get out guides so that, for example, absentee ballots are being accepted according to the same standards, what counts, what doesn't count as a signature statewide. Everything's done reasonably uniformly, which is important as a 14th Amendment due process kind of thing, that or equal protection of laws, rather, kind of thing that you want to have consistent standards. So that's their responsibility. But they also very critically are supporting that with some key statewide computer systems, the statewide voter registration system, the election reporting system, the voter information portal. Many of you know, if you go to mnvotes.gov, you can do things like pull up your ballot, find where you vote, check the status of your absentee ballot, all those things. That's a statewide system. And the state is also in the loop as far as all the election equipment for the polling places, that they do the certification process. So there's a lot on the Secretary of State's office plate, and I do emphasize office. Secretary personally doesn't do all those things. They've got an incredible staff there. Many of them are themselves former county and municipal election administrators, so they have that experience. They know what it is that the local units need. So just to kind of run through one by one some of those areas, if we start by looking at voter registration, the idea in the voter registration process is that that's where you're getting the confirmation that somebody's going to be eligible to vote. That eligibility is certified again at the time they actually vote. You may not pay a whole lot of attention to the fine print when you sign the poll book, but you are signing an attestation that you are eligible each time. But at the registration point, you're looking at, is the person 18, US citizen, a resident of Minnesota for 20 days, and resident within their precinct where they're registering. That doesn't have to be for 20 days. That's just half of election day you reside there, and not under some court-ordered disability to your voting rights, whether from a felony conviction or incompetence or some guardianship orders. So those are the kinds of things that in some sense are checked. There is no perfect check for any of those things, really. Fundamentally, the voter is swearing under penalty of perjury that they meet those, or that they will meet them, I should say, as of election day. That's kind of an important distinction as we're currently in the absentee voting period, right? You have someone who maybe is turning 18 between now and November 8th. Can they register and vote absentee? Answer, yes. They're swearing that they will be 18. Or somebody who just moved to Minnesota will have been a resident 20 days as of election day. The voter registration in Minnesota as a statewide kind of process dates to 1973. prior to that point, it depended where you lived. Some places there was a municipal registration. There were no county registrations. It was municipal. Other parts of the state, there was no registration at all. You just walked in, said who you were, voted. That was the end of the story, which today, you know, when I talk to people, they're kind of mind boggled, both by the idea that you could vote without registration, but also by the idea that it could depend on where you live, the idea of lack of consistency. But that's a kind of a modern consideration. The really, to some extent, the post-Bush versus Gore era, when we really have had so much emphasis on statewide consistency. The 1973 law that brought in voter registration as a consistent practice for Minnesota also was the one that introduced election day registration. So we've really never had an era when advance registration was a statewide requirement in Minnesota. That's different from, you know, many other states. And the story Joan Grow, the former Secretary of State, who as a member of the State House helped write that bill, told me, is that the reason, she says, why they put the election day registration in there is because the rural areas that previously were not doing voter registration at all demanded it as a sort of more gentle path into a registration requirement. They were worried about imposing registration for the first time without that. It's kind of a little ironic today. It's maybe more the other way around, that it's in the urban areas where people tend to be more mobile, that the election day registration is more heavily utilized. The residence tends to be a little more stable in greater Minnesota. So that was put in place. It's, I think, been extremely successful. I think it has a lot to do with why we have nation-leading voter turnout in Minnesota, but it's also from the get-go and to this day been a little on the controversial side. I think people don't understand that there is some corroboration of voter eligibility, in particular with regard to residents. That's the most often stumbled over eligibility requirement. And one way or another, there has to be some corroboration. If you register on election day, many of you know you have to present some sort of a so-called proof of residence, I would say corroboration of residence. If you instead vote, register in advance, then what's done is that the statewide voter registration system communicates with the Department of Vehicle Services and other databases, tries to check up on you that way, and the county sends a postcard to make sure it's deliverable to your address. And if they can get the confirmation, great. Otherwise, there's a note on your record, and when you show up to vote, they will ask for confirmation of your identity at the voting time if it couldn't be confirmed, as it usually can be in advance. So one way or the other, it's different corroboration, but it's corroboration. For the election day registration, by far the most common is that people show up with a up-to-date driver's license or state ID card with the current address. I think that out of, you know, I think if you had 14 people show up to do election day registration, you would expect 10 of them to have up-to-date voter photo ID. You would expect to have maybe another 2 that had an old driver's license with a different address, and then a bill or bank statement or something like that to establish their current address. 1 who had another person who was vouching for them, an eyewitness who could testify that they were residing there in the precinct. And then the 14th would be all the other stuff lumped together that are more minor than that. So you can see it falls off rapidly in frequency. But I think what's important is that if you were to require strictly just the current residence beyond your driver's license, you would be missing 4 out of 14 or something. And you would be encouraging people to keep voting where they used to live rather than doing the honest thing and switching and registering where they now live. We help keep honest people honest with the flexibility to prove residence in other ways. And I think that perspective is important, that we remember that flexibility can actually increase the quality, the integrity of the process. The overall use of election day registration used to depend very strongly on how high turnout a year it was. Low turnout years where you had just core voters who reliably vote every time, you had low use of election day registration. High turnout elections where you pulled in more infrequent voters or new voters, you had very high use. We had, situations where it got as high as 20% of the voters doing election day registration in years like 2004, I think was maybe a peak year. And then what happened is, as Colleen mentioned in her introduction of me, in 2014, we introduced online voter registration and some other innovations. And since then, election day registration has been dramatically lower. And so we've been seeing maybe 7-8%, even in a high turnout year like 2020 was. Moving on, I think. After registration, next obvious topic is voting. You could vote in a polling place, you could vote in the absentee processes. Polling place voting, there's a lot one can say about it, but I think the topic that seems to attract the most concern has been revolving around the technology use. The first place you're likely to see technology when you step into a polling place is the electronic poll book. Most Minnesotans vote in precincts or counties that use those. Of the ones that are on the call tonight, obviously Edina in Hennepin County, the largest county in the state, uses electronic poll books. I think we have some people from Blue Earth County uses electronic poll books. Most of the state does, but interestingly, Nicollet County, where St. Peter is, I think maybe one of the most populous of the counties that are still using the paper poll book. So we have an example of that on the call tonight. The reason why it's not 100% one way or the other is because there are trade-offs, there are pluses and minuses. The big issue with electronic poll book use is reliability, that if you have a failure, it can make it very difficult to recover, switch to the paper backup system, get people processed without having a huge tie-up to your voting process. So that's, I think, I haven't spoken with Nicollet County officials, but I suspect the reason they've been shy about it is wanting to make sure that they don't risk any kind of a breakdown. Minnesota's electronic poll books are by design much more reliable than in some of the other states. We have two big things going for us. One is that our electronic poll books, unlike some others, do not rely on any kind of networking or connection to a central server for their normal operation. You can check in voters, you can register new election day registrants on a purely local basis without any connection. What the connection is used for is for updating absentee voting records so that the absentee processing at the central office can continue on election day, and yet you can still be sure people are only voting in one place or the other. that between when an absentee envelope is marked as accepted and when it's opened and tabulated, you stop and you check that the poll book shows they haven't signed in to vote in the polling place yet. And you mark the polling book as they've voted absentee. And only then, after you've got that AB marking in the poll book, do you open the envelope. That's the essential interlock. It's always been that way in Minnesota, whether you use a paper poll book or an electronic poll book. But if you're an election judge in a paper poll book precinct, you may be getting phone calls from the county saying, could you mark AB on these lines? Or you may have someone drop by the polling place with a supplemental list or that kind of thing. And that communication can be done much more efficiently if you've got a computer connection instead. Certainly was very helpful in 2020 with the volume of absentee voting that went on. If the connection fails, you just have to hold off on processing those absentee ballots until later. It's not a big deal. The other big reliability thing we've got going is paper. Just like the ultimate record for the votes is the paper ballot, the ultimate record for voter sign-ins is paper certificates that are printed out and signed by each voter as they sign in. The ultimate record for every election day registration is a voter registration application that's printed out and signed by the voter as every single transaction on the electronic poll book system produces a paper trail. So if the computer, were to burst into flames and just disappear from the face of the earth, as long as the flames didn't spread to the pile of paper, you would still have that, and that's kept 22 months, just like any other election record is. The next piece of technology you might encounter, ballot marking device. Many of you may have been familiar. I know I think everyone on this call pretty much is from a jurisdiction that uses the ES&S voting system. So you may be familiar with the AutoMark machines, which were these big, heavy, clunky ballot marking devices. More recently, the switch has been to the smaller, lighter Omni ballot device. But regardless, there's some sort of computer technology that lets people who might have some difficulty using a pen, might have some difficulty with eyesight, other issues, have an alternative. And anyone can use it, but it's primarily there because of its role in accessibility. And again, contrasting with other states, there are states where every voter uses a ballot marking device. They do not do hand-marked ballots. And that obviously poses some reliability issues. It's also posed some trust issues. There's a lot of people who wonder, can you trust that ballot marking device to really mark what you wanted onto the ballot? That's been particularly an issue if it's marked not in a human readable format, but something like a QR code that gets scanned that the computer can interpret, but you don't really have any way of knowing whether that's a faithful encoding of your vote. Those issues don't arise in Minnesota, not only because the vast majority of our ballots are marked by hand, but also because even the ones that go through the ballot marking device are marked in the exact same format. That a ballot marking device ballot is not encoded in some secret format. It's still just filled in ovals next to names, the same way as with the hand-marked ballots. Final and most obvious technology in the polling place is the tabulator, the optical scan ballot counter that you feed your ballot through. And again, it's been a topic of concern. It's been a topic where distrust has arisen. Can you count on it to accurately count the ballots? What about network connections? Could it be taken over remotely? Those sorts of things. It's important to know that they're not only certified and not only tested in advance, and not only tested publicly in advance, but also routinely audited afterwards, that precincts are randomly sampled and hand counted. So ultimately, you don't really need to trust it. We have hand count, we have the paper ballot, we have the ability to count those ballots. And so we have the evidence that shows the tabulators are correctly tabulating. That said, if a tabulator were somehow taken over and produced wrong results on election night, and they were only found later when hand counting was done, it would just be a huge hit to public confidence if there was one set of election results on election night, and then weeks later another totally different set of election results. Everyone would have their own favorite for which one to believe, the one where their candidate won. And so that would not be a good thing. So there are, in fact, some strong protections in place to make sure that those tabulators are reasonably secure. In particular, with regard to the concern that's been raised about any kind of a network connection or telecommunications, the thing you need to know is that in Minnesota, by law, there is no connection during voting hours. In many jurisdictions, that's achieved through the simple practice of just not having the equipment for a connection. There is no connection ever at any time. There are other jurisdictions here in Hennepin County, where Edina is, for example, which have cellular modems in the tabulators that are used after the polls have closed, after the official results have been printed out in durable form on paper, and have also been stored onto the removable storage device. Then connection is made to the county server to upload unofficial results, so that those preliminary results, those results that come out on election night, can be done more quickly, but they're always then checked later against the printout. I do hear people say, well, how do you know they don't connect until afterward? And it's not just some sort of distrust that the machines may have been somehow sabotaged or misdesigned or corrupted or whatever, but people who wonder, might some head election judge not just kind of accidentally connect it early, or have it connected all day long, or that sort of thing. And the answer is, if you've ever been in a polling place, if you've ever been a head election judge, it's just not the kind of thing you can accidentally do. There's not a switch you can leave switch to the connected position. What it takes is you have to use a key, open a compartment. Inside that compartment, there's a push button. You hold that push button down for 5 seconds. After you've held it down for 5 seconds, then a mode pops up on the screen where you can select the close the polls function. You select that, the printout is generated for the official results, and only then there's another button on the screen for connect and transmit the results, and you do that. So it's just not physically possible. You're not going to accidentally open a locked compartment and hold something down for 5 seconds, that kind of thing. Why do we risk having complicated computer equipment? Maybe it would be better if we either hand counted the ballots, or instead of having computers in every polling place, just gathered up the paper ballots and ran them through the high-speed central tabulators that are used for the absentee ballots. And I think there's been a lot of public conversation nationally lately about the fact that hand counting just is an extremely error-prone and inefficient process that doesn't work at scale. But the other one, why don't you centrally count? I think that's not really appreciated. I think people have forgotten why it was back in the 1980s that the precinct optical scanners were ever developed in the first place. And the answer is that they provide an immediate feedback to the voter, that they're there not so much as a way of getting the counts for the final results as they are as a way of providing the voter the feedback if they voted for too many people for one office, or if they voted in more than one party during the primary, which is a really, really common problem in Minnesota. Our partisan primaries trip people up all the time with voting in more than one column. And there's really no other privacy preserving way that you can check people's ballots in the polling place. You can't have election judges looking at them and saying, oh no, you voted too many times here. That just wouldn't be compatible with a secret ballot. So that's the fundamental gain that we get by having that equipment. Absentee voting is a topic I could literally spend all night on. I hope there will be good questions about absentee voting. Many people who have never used it don't understand even the basics. They don't understand that if you got your hands on several different ballots somehow, you still couldn't cast them all. That when you send in a ballot, you're sending it in a signature envelope with a barcode on it that corresponds to an application that was already processed. And so if you haven't applied multiple times and had multiple applications accepted and had multiple barcodes issued to you, you could have all the ballots in the world, the paper with the little ovals. You could fill in all the ovals you want, but you're not going to have the ability to get more than one of them counted. And the connection to the individual voter is done at that time the application is processed. There's a small number of applications that come in from brand new voters where they're not going to be a registered voter until the voter registration application they submit along with the ballot is processed. And so that's still tied to their identifying information in the statewide voter registration system. But the vast majority are from already registered voters. They may be ones who need to update the registration. They may still be getting a voter registration application with their ballot and need to send it back, but it's still already tied in the system to their existing voter record. So you typically have, from the get-go, one voter tied to one ballot. If for some reason it's lost, it's stolen, it's damaged, they contact the office, they ask for another one. That's not a problem. The barcode number on that particular ballot is marked in the system as not being valid anymore, marked as spoiled or lost, and a new one issued. And you can have two that have been issued, but only one of the two is in a status where it's counted. If it comes back, it gets marked in the system as having come back. So if someone somehow duplicated the code, sent a second one with that same code again, it couldn't be counted again because you've already marked in the system that that particular number has been received. The checks that are done ensure that it's filled out. They ensure that the voter is signed off on their certification, where they certify that they're eligible, and that there's some sort of an identification that's indicating it really came from that voter. Ordinarily, since 2010, that identification has taken the form of a matching ID number. That you put your driver's license number on the application form, and again on the signature envelope, where you put the last four digits of your Social Security on the application form, and again on the signature envelope. The use of handwriting, of looking at two signatures and seeing are they really the same, has been reserved just as a fallback if there's a problem. Some people forget about putting the ID number on, or they put the wrong ID number on, or they skip, they're copying the driver's license number, which is a letter in 12 digits, and they miss one of those 12 digits. It's really easy to do. then you've got the signature comparison as a fallback. But we try not to do that since 2010 because the experience, the 2008 Coleman-Franken debacle, was that it turns out signature comparison is really hard. People don't do it very well. So then, once you've got that nailed down, that's great. If there's a problem, you can still notify the voter. And that's one of the most important things. Why do we have people voting early when their vote's not going to get counted until election day anyway? Well, one big answer is if something goes wrong, they have time to fix it. Every elections office around the state is required to, within a few days of getting a ballot, have figured out whether it meets the acceptance standard. If not, send a replacement ballot with an explanatory letter. If it's close to election day, instead, not just mail a replacement ballot, but call, follow up personally with the voter. I've had to do some of that calling. It's not great to call someone and say, gee, I'm really sorry. But it actually, I find, feels pretty good because, start with, I don't say we rejected your ballot. I say we were unable to accept your ballot because of this and that. So it's a little softened, but then quickly switch to the real focus of the conversation, which is, here's how you can still vote. Let's talk about the fact you might still be able to go and do an in-person absentee. Here are the hours. Here's the place where it's up. Or maybe you can vote in person at your polling place. Your polling place is Trinity Church down the street from you at 33rd. Do you know where that is? Make sure they've got the plan. If they say they have a mobility issue, talk about curbside voting. If they're totally homebound, talk about the ability of someone else to come and pick up a ballot for them, the so-called agent delivery process. So you kind of can work through. And that's, as I say, that's one of the real strengths of Minnesota absentee balloting, that we have this codified process for notifying anyone whose ballot is rejected. The accepted ballots are held sealed in their envelopes until 1 week before the election, at which point we start opening them and scanning the ballots. So the question is, if you've gone to all this trouble to attach a ballot to a specific voter's identity, how do you then open and process them in a way that preserves the secrecy of their votes? And that's why we have this nested system of envelopes. Many of you have voted absentee, you've encountered, you put the ballot in a tan secrecy envelope, you put the tan secrecy envelope in a white signature envelope. Why? The answer is because at processing time, we open all the signature envelopes, pull out all the secrecy envelopes, set them aside separately. You have a pile of empty signature envelopes, a pile of completely anonymous secrecy envelopes, make sure they're the same number, so forth. Open those, process them with the signature envelopes out of sight. You don't know who's you're processing, you just know which precinct. You check that you've got one ballot per envelope, you check they're from the right precinct, you check that none of them are so badly damaged they need to be copied over before they can be scanned. If they are, you do. That's part of the process. That's another example, something that needs 2 election judges of 2 different major parties, just like if we do signature comparison, also if we do duplication, copying over, that's a party balanced process in the absentee ballot board. I mentioned checking counts. There's a ton of reconciliation work also in the polling places. I know Colleen, who's moderating tonight or introduced me tonight, has had to do more than her share of reconciling polling place books. I gave her a button that says election judges count to wear when she did that, because indeed election judges count. They count a lot. They count that they wound up with the same number of ballots at the end of the evening as in the morning. And every single blank ballot is either still blank or in the ballot box or in the spoiled envelope. Somewhere that ballot is accounted for. Maybe there's a note in the log that says somebody walked out with one. The number of people who signed in to vote should equal the number of votes, unless you, again, have some special case documented. So that's all the reconciliation. Afterward, canvassing double checks all those numbers, double checks everything's accounted for, but also double checks those paper printouts of the votes that were tabulated against what's been recorded in the central computer system, adjusts any reporting errors, make sure that we have complete and correct results. And those are what are adopted by the county canvassing board and then ultimately by the state canvassing board. So we're rolling up from the precinct level to the county level to the state. And in between the two canvassing boards, that's when the post-election review fits in. And I think that's kind of a crucial piece, that it's timed after the canvassing board has officially adopted what the numbers are from each precinct, because that freezes that baseline in place that gets audited. Every precinct has to be audit ready. Every precinct has to be in good shape, because only after you've gotten that canvass done does the canvassing board do the random selection by lot of the precincts that are audited. So potentially any of them might be. And what happens is in a low population county, they select 2 precincts. Somewhat bigger counties, it's 3 or 4 and so forth on up. Biggest would be Hennepin County, where Edina is, where Minneapolis is. In 2020, there were 13 precincts selected for Hennepin County, according to the formula. This year, it's only going to be 12, just because the number of precincts slightly dropped. The population went up a little, but the number of precincts went down over a threshold. And so the way the formula works, it's now only 12. But regardless, point being, you have people looking at the ballots and figuring out, this is a vote for this candidate, it goes on their pile. This is a vote for this other candidate, it goes on their pile. Every ballot on a pile at the end, count in stacks of 25 how many ballots are in each pile. So it's an extremely tangible, extremely observable by the public way of making sure you know exactly what the counts are, and that's checked against what the machines do. And the answer is they agree every time. We have yet to have, and it's been going since 2006, yet to have any issues arise through that post-election review process. I often have people say, how is that different from a recount? Well, there are a number of differences, but maybe the crucial one is when a losing candidate says, I demand a recount, at that point, you've got a contested kind of situation where the losing candidate is trying to show really they won. The winning candidate is trying to defend their position. And so they're allowed to each have observers present and ask we, the recount officials, pick up a ballot and look at it, and the 2 of us, it's always 2, decide it's marked for candidate A and put it on candidate A's pile. You're going to have an observer from candidate B's campaign taking a look at it and seeing whether they object, whether they're going to say, no, that's not for candidate A, that's for me. Or maybe it's for neither of us. Or that ballot you put on the pile for neither of us, that's really for my candidate, whatever. So they have that opportunity. Those are hashed out as best they can be there in the recount room, and any that are not resolved go to the canvassing board for a final determination. We saw a great deal of that in 2008. Hopefully we'll never again have a recount of that scale, but we're ready for it. if it should happen. Close elections, a recount can be publicly funded because it's not just the losing candidate who has an interest in getting the right answer. We, the public in general, want to know that our elected officials are really the plurality winners. And so in order to provide that public confidence, in order to provide that public service, the recount is publicly funded. And it's publicly funded if there's really any realistic hope the outcome would change. The standard for larger elections is a 1/4 percentage point, smaller ones is a 1/2 percentage point. In reality, the number of ballots that are ever really at issue are down in the 100ths of a percent. A 1/4 of a percent is really a lot. There's really no realistic prospect you would see that kind of a change. A losing candidate can ask for a recount even if the difference is much more than that. One thing I think we need to understand in this era where there's a great deal of distrust is that if anyone thinks the ballots were not accurately tabulated and they lose an election, they can say, no, I'm going to demand a recount. They have to put up some money, but it's not an unreasonable amount of money, in part because they're allowed to target up to 3 precincts that they're particularly concerned about, have those counted first, and then decide whether to commit to the rest. So you can sort of dip your toe in the water, test it out, see if you're really getting anywhere. And if you're vindicated and you win, then you get to keep all your money. It's been in escrow, but you don't actually get charged, because obviously the public wants the right answer. We're willing to pay for the right answer. You don't have to pay for that. But also, and this is much less widely known, if a recount doesn't change who won, but does shift the results by more than that 1/4 of a percent accuracy standard, then again, it's publicly paid for. So if somebody loses by, 5 points and they call for a recount and it shifts and now they're only losing by 4 points, they're still losing. But boy, did they demonstrate something of considerable public interest. If they demonstrated that these tabulation systems that we thought were, accurate to the 100ths of a percent were off by a full percentage point, that would be shocking news. And we, the public, would gladly pay for that. That's in law. That's in Minnesota statute, that the recount is free under that case. So really, anyone who thinks there's any substantial problem, my answer to them would be, show us. You can do it. There's a mechanism there to do it. No one has ever. There have been attempts made. 2020, there were some local legislative candidates who had some doubts about their elections. None of them were able to show any problems. And then finally, if all else fails, they can go to court. There's a court contest mechanism. But honestly, you have to have some real case. The courts do not put up with just, I have a hunch that something might be wrong here, right? They're looking for some real specific issue that they need to adjudicate. So that's my sort of soup to nuts grand tour of elections, from registration through recounts and election contests. On the one hand, I feel like I probably covered a lot of ground many of you are already familiar with. I apologize for boring you. On the other hand, I feel like I left out half of the good stuff, but I wanted to make sure we had a healthy amount of time left for questions. I know that we've got some probably popping up in the chat already. I'd be glad to take a whack at any of them. If there's something I don't know, I promise you I won't make an answer up. I'll look into it after we get offline, and I'll email the organizers a an answer after the fact that they can distribute out, so that we make sure we stay in the realm of accurate information. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Hailperin. What an informative, deep, and complex topic, and you made it so easily digestible. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions, and I encourage the rest of you, if you have some other thoughts, please make sure and put it in the chat, or you can always turn your mic on and ask it yourself. Our first question is from Cindy. Some people have claimed that bad actors can steal or corrupt information by the use of a thumb drive. Is there even a port for a storage device on a voting tabulator?
Sure. So the tabulators that are used in the polling places all do have some sort of a removable storage device. That's part of how configuration information is provided to them initially and how results are retrieved from them. But those are intentionally somewhat non-standard, and then also are within a locked compartment. You don't have physical access to them without a key. In general, election equipment is all centered around making the physical access a little difficult, but also making it tamper evident. There are seals that you would have to break in order to do many things, and then you can see that that seal has been broken. So I would say in general, it's not something I would be particularly concerned about. That said, if I were an election judge in a polling place, I surely would be, and I have been an election judge in a polling place, I surely would be casting my eyes around the room all the time, keeping an eye open for things that are out of the ordinary. 9 times out of 10, what's out of the ordinary is just someone who's confused and is trying to put their ballot into the automark machine instead of the ballot tabulator or something like that. But you know, you have to have that situational awareness if you're an election judge. You have to understand what your voters in the polling place are doing. And if someone were fiddling around in the back of a machine trying to look for a port, that would be a concern.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Patrick has a question. Does the absentee process afford the voter to rectify ballot level errors like the tabulator does during in-precinct voting?
Well, that's a great question, Patrick. Thanks for asking that. There are really 2 parts to that. One is, does the voter get any feedback, which is what the tabulator in the polling place does, to alert them that they have some reason to correct a problem. And then the other is there actually a mechanism by which they can? And the answer depends on which variant of absentee voting you're using. If you're doing absentee by mail, where you put your ballot in a succession of envelopes and mail it in or drop it off for that matter, or if you're doing in-person voting prior to the last week, where again, although you're at the elections office, you're putting your ballot in a succession of envelopes just as though you were mailing it in. In those cases, there is no feedback. By the time those envelopes are opened, and anyone could tell that there was a problem with the ballot, the signature envelope has been separated from the secrecy envelope. And so once the secrecy envelope is opened and the ballot is observable, you have no idea whose it is. So you couldn't possibly notify them that there was a problem. By contrast, the last week, if you go to your local elections office and vote in person absentee, you don't have to seal your ballot in envelopes. Instead, there's a process called direct balloting, where you can insert your ballot into a tabulator, just like in a precinct. It's different from precinct voting in that you're still filling out an absentee ballot application form. You're still going through much of the same process as with absentee balloting, but at the end of the process, there are no envelopes. Instead, you're going straight into a tabulator. And so then you get the exact same feedback you would in a polling place if you do something like vote for too many candidates or vote across party lines. And you can rectify it the same way you would in the polling place. You take it back to the staff and you say, there's a problem here. I want to spoil this ballot. They put it in the spoiled ballot container. They issue you a new ballot. You're on your way. So that's the answer. And that's one of the reasons why direct balloting has been very popular. It was introduced just a handful of years ago and has just taken off like wildfire. And it's one of the rare things where there's bipartisan agreement. I monitor social media and I see people on the far right and the far left both advocating direct balloting. So if you go and if you look at the numbers, about somewhat more than half of the absentee votes are cast that last week. We have a 46-day period, but people don't spread out evenly over that whole 46. A lot of the voting is in that final week, and a lot is done using direct balloting. That said, if you vote in the envelopes and you somehow know you made a mistake, maybe somebody explains to you something you didn't previously understand about the way partisan primaries work or something, or maybe it's just you changed your mind about which candidate you want to vote for. It's not the kind of error that a tabulator would tell you about. It's just an error in who you voted for. You absolutely, until that last week, while your ballot is still sealed in its envelopes, can contact the elections office and say, hey, I changed my mind. And they will pull that envelope out of the vault and they will mark it on the envelope as spoiled. And they will mark it in the statewide voter registration system as spoiled. Spoiled just means, canceled, invalidated. And then they can issue you another absentee ballot if you want, or you can go to your precinct polling place on election day if you want. You're back in the running again. You're back to being a voter once you've had them retrieve that ballot and cancel it. So that's your option up until the 1 week point. Then that's when the envelopes start opening. And so that's the, I won't say drop dead point, but the point of commitment.
Our next question comes from Colleen. In your experience, are the individuals that don't trust election results uninformed about the layers of checks and balances, or are they motivated by something else?
Both. I think that people have a much easier time believing things that support the outcome they want. I mean, if you look at levels of confidence by party, 2016 versus 2020, you can see the Democratic confidence did not dip as low in 2016 as the Republican confidence did in 2020, but it was indeed the case that whichever party was on the losing end tended to be the ones that had more questions, and the winning tended to be more confident. So people have an easier time accepting things that fit their own view about what a correct result should be. But on the other hand, there's a ton of evidence that shows that the more familiar people are with the way the systems really work, the less they fill in the blanks with guesswork, supposition, rumors, conspiracy theories, whatever. People who have served as election judges, people who have other ways of really knowing what's going on, do tend to have, regardless of their party affiliation, a higher level of confidence. So it's both being uninformed and wishful thinking.
That leads us to another question from Patrick. Any system is unlikely to be 100% infallible, just statistically sufficient. Where does Minnesota elections have room to grow, if anywhere?
Sure. So thanks, Patrick. I think Patrick is one of my former students, so he's used to asking me questions.
Mhm.
The obvious place where we have room to grow is that some Minnesotans still find it really fairly difficult to vote. I mean, it's hard to remember that even with all these different options for how you can vote, it is a kind of a daunting bureaucratic process that's really better suited to people with high levels of educational attainment, high levels of English language literacy. There are people who it's a real hurdle for. And so, could we get our turn up above 80% of eligible? Yeah, that's certainly possible, room for growth. But also of the 80% who already are voting, there are many who are doing so with less comfort, with more need for assistance, with less sense of independence and so forth than they might. We don't have the greatest accommodations for variations in human abilities of all kinds. So that's certainly room. Beyond that, in terms of the kinds of errors and so forth, we're constantly having to work on ways of checking proactively for incorrect data in the statewide voter registration system. I mean, people make typos, people get things wrong, people, without any ill intent at all, there's a percentage of people who don't really live where they're listed at, somebody who's in the system at 545 North 2nd Street and they actually live at 545 South 2nd Street or something, right? There's all these just messy little problems, and the state's technology for checking those things and correcting those things is constantly in need of attention. The election day registration process, particularly with the use of electronic poll books, is really quite good, and I think doesn't necessarily provide any greater hurdles to integrity than any other kind does. But that said, I think if we can drive even further down the use of election day registration and get even more registration done in advance, we will certainly have more room for checking and more room for making sure everything is as it ought to be. And there's an obvious way to do that. I mean, I said that something like 10 out of every 14 election day registrants has an up-to-date driver's license with their current address on it, which leads to the obvious question, well, why didn't they register when they got that driver's license? There's just a little checkbox they needed to check that they could have been registered. Most election day registrants don't need to be election day registrants. And the obvious solution is to turn that default around, that people are a lot better at filling out the parts of forms that directly are between them and their goal, are relevant to achieving what they're there to do. they're there to get a driver's license. They're not really there to register. They don't have any real incentive to check that box. But if it were an opt-out system, you would have a lot fewer election day registrations. So that's certainly one answer to Patrick's question. You know, beyond that, as far as the actual, you know, ballots that come in, most of the ones that are rejected, people do eventually find a way to vote. They do wind up voting, but there are some who don't. If we could get the rejection rate on absentee ballots down, that would certainly improve matters. And the obvious stumbling block there is the witness requirement. In 2020, we tried the experiment of having people who had up-to-date registration not needing to have a witness. And sure enough, the rejection rate went way down because that's a common cause of rejection. It's not that people aren't complying with the substance of the requirement, it's just the formality of actually getting someone to fill it out and fill it out correctly and have their address and have their signature and so forth. It's just one more set of things you can get wrong, and people do get wrong. And so if you take a look at what that witness requirement actually achieves versus that it's causing some people to lose their vote, I think there's a real case that could be made. It's not politically feasible. I mean, you know, short of a Democratic trifecta, getting rid of the witness requirement is just not going to happen. But that would definitely increase the overall number of eligible voters who had their votes counted.
A couple more questions are coming up. This is a follow-up to the absentee ballot errors. Do we have any stats on how many ballots have errors?
So there are two different kinds of errors with regard to an absentee ballot. One is the errors in filling out the signature envelope, or maybe the voter registration application, if it's a case where one needed to be included, that cause rejection. And yes, we have statistics. They're on the Secretary of State's website regarding not only how many ballots have been rejected in each election, but how that breaks down by the reason for the rejection. How many was because they were missing the witness signature, or how many because the voter didn't sign, or how many because it was late, or all these different things. It's a little less than 100% clear because there's nothing there to show whether the same voter tried again and was more successful the second time, that sort of thing. But you do get some sense of what's going on with those. The other kind of errors, though, the overvotes and cross-party votes that cause the actual ballot, not the envelope, but the ballot, to be problematic. That data is much harder to find. For the precincts that are selected for the post-election review, the post-election, which are a random sample of precincts, the post-election review reports do include overvote data on how many people marked more candidates than they were allowed to in a particular race. Beyond that, it's in the kind of raw data that the elections offices use in the canvassing process. It would be available on a public information request kind of basis, but there's no widely available published kind of form of that.
I'm going to go to a question from Edith, and then we'll wrap things up with a great question from Cindy. But our question from Edith: how can people living in small townships have more confidence in their mail ballot process?
Well, thanks, Edie. I appreciate your asking that because I had, in fact, skipped entirely over mail ballots when I was talking about absentee ballots. So that's a distinction not everyone's familiar with. Minnesota, for many years now, has allowed some rural areas. They have to be outside the metro counties. So even a small township in the 7-county metro area would not be allowed to use it. They have to be outside the 7 counties, and they have to be either a township or an unorganized part of a county, not a municipality at all, or a city with fewer than 400 registered voters. If they meet any of those criteria, then the local governing board can optionally choose not to have a precinct polling place on election day, and instead just send out a ballot by mail to all the registered voters, to each registered voter, non-forwardable mail to their residence address. And anyone who's missed by that because maybe they're a new voter or something, they still have the absentee process available. They can apply for an absentee ballot by mail, or they can do the in-person absentee voting up to and including election day itself. So you do have an election day voting option, but it's typically at your county auditor's office. I would say in Blue Earth County and Nicollet County, where I think we have a fair bit of audience here, it's maybe about half the precincts are mail ballot precincts. Statewide, it's about a third of the precincts are mail ballot precincts, but they're very heavily skewed towards low population ones. And so 2020, it was 5.7% of all ballots in the state were in those mail ballot precincts. So you have a third of the precincts, but only 5 or 6% of the voters, because they're the small, low population places. So the question is, how can they have more confidence in the process? I think one thing that's important to know is that those ballots are sent as non-forwardable mail. So in fact, they are confirming that you reside at your residence address the same way we would confirm, the counties send out these so-called postal verification cards, which are non-forwardable postcards as a way of testing residence addresses. They do that anyway in advance of the mail balloting, but the mail ballot itself is kind of a confirmation that you really have it. So it's got that extra safeguard built in. It's got all the same safeguards as the absentee voting has. Some people feel like it's pressuring them into voting by mail. They would rather vote in person, but the only place they can vote in person is the county office. That could be a long way away. It's not convenient, and so on and so on. All that's true. I mean, it's a tough trade-off that those local township commissioners or city commissioners or whatever are making, trying to decide that. I think you have to be involved in your local political process and make sure that it's reflecting the will of the people there. Why do they do it? I don't think it's just about saving money. Originally, historically, I think one of the big reasons why local units went to mail balloting was because it was very difficult to find polling places that were accessible to people with disabilities. That many rural areas, there just isn't a good location to have a polling place. More recently, why has it grown so much? I think we're seeing a real generational turnover in the election judge population. We've had a very much aging election judge population up, prior to 2020. And in 2020, a lot of the more senior election judges stepped away and a lot of young people stepped in. And so the average age of election judges dramatically fell in 2020. And I think in many rural areas, they just weren't confident that generational turnover was going to happen smoothly. You might have a much smaller pool of young people to draw on in a small rural community. And just to have that when you're making the decision months in advance, are we going to go mail ballot or are we going to go with a precinct polling place? You're kind of crossing your fingers and hoping that enough election judges are going to step forward. I can see why they might have chosen not to. But yeah, Edie's concern is a real concern.
Cindy poses an interesting opportunity for you to do some prediction here. What are you expecting to see on November 8 at the polls and afterwards as the ballots are tabulated?
Well, I'm certainly not going to say anything about what I expect in terms of the results. I just am not that foolish. But as far as, what do I expect to see going on? I expect in general it's going to be very smooth. I mean, we really have a very professional set of election administrators around the state. If they were able to handle 2020, they should be able to handle 2022 without any problem. There will be little things that go wrong every year. There's no election where you don't have, some polling place with a power outage or, all sorts of things happen. Things will, but what worries me, and probably will happen to some degree in some places, is I do worry there may be some very assertive either challengers or new election judges who aren't familiar yet with the process, or even just plain voters or whatever, who see something they don't understand, they think it's a problem, and they don't just kind of quietly go home or write up a complaint form or something, but instead are really, in the face of the head election judge saying, hey, stop, you can't do this. And we may have election jurisdictions around the state, around the nation are teaching de-escalation techniques. It may be that somewhere those are needed. It may be that there's somebody who's upset. And I don't think it's going to be a huge problem. I'm not anticipating, or you ask afterwards, after the election, I don't anticipate, central count elections offices being stormed, January 6th coming to the local elections office or something. I don't anticipate that, but I do think there may be a somewhat higher level of tension than we sometimes see.
And that was Cindy's follow-up question. Are you hearing about any organized efforts to challenge?
I have certainly heard that the post-election reviews are going to be much more actively attended this year than they have in the past. 2020, there were some that were tense. Dakota County certainly was very tense in 2020. And I think there will be more. I think the 2020 post-election review, frankly, historically, post-election reviews, like most of these things that are open to the public, have rarely attracted any members of the public at all. A few really geeky elections nerds, show up, like me. But 2022, we will see that, and people will want to look closely, and people will want to really know what's going on. Challenging, I think everyone's in kind of wait and see mode. I know there are people who are going to be monitoring the rate at which results come in, and whether the early results lean more one way and shift later to a different lean and so on, because they've got completely unfounded theories about what that reveals about some supposed wrongdoing. I know they're going to be looking, but as to whether they're going to actually do anything with what they see, I think more likely you're just going to see, social media griping and groaning, and if anything real, it's going to be the losing candidates, exercising their rights. If we have a narrow, if something's narrowly divided, certainly if it's in that 0.25% range, I mean, obviously, no one's going to pass up their legal opportunities that they have.
Thank you, audience, for all the questions. Before I throw it over to Colleen to wrap us up, I did want to mention that we did tape this session, and we will be posting it on the League of Women Voters Edina YouTube channel, which I will share the link with Colleen as soon as it gets posted, and invite you all to share that link with friends and family so they can listen to this fabulous conversation that we've been having with Professor Hailperin. Colleen, I'll throw it over to you to wrap us up.
And I did thank you, Julie, so much, and all the Edina people for tagging on with us and handling all the technology too. And so I really don't have that much to say, but just to thank you again, Max, for agreeing to do this. And it's been so informative. I've really I feel like I'm an election judge, and I feel like I learned some things too. So thanks to you and to all the participants from the Edina and St. Peter Area League.
Great. I'll just add my thanks.
So I think we're done for the evening then, and I'm wishing everybody a calm rest of the election season. Yes.
We all say amen.